The KGB spent years hunting for the mole who destroyed their entire spy network. They turned the world upside down looking for him. But they missed one tiny detail. The man they were hunting was already sitting in their own prison, sewing gloves for 30 kopecks a day. In the spring of 1983, the first chief directorate of the KGB experienced a collapse so absolute it felt like the end of the world. Within a matter of weeks, 47 Soviet diplomats and intelligence officers were expelled from France in a single surgical strike that blinded the empire's eyes in Western Europe. From Paris to Washington, Soviet spy networks were crumbling like sandcastles. The General Secretary, Andropov, was in a state of cold, murderous fury, demanding the head of the man responsible for this unprecedented catastrophe. But in the classified cables of the West, the culprit had no face. He was known only by the code name Farewell, a phantom whose 4,000 leaked secret documents had exposed a humiliating truth. The Soviet Union's military-industrial complex was a parasitic organism built entirely on stolen Western technology. Every counterintelligence unit from Moscow to Berlin was hunting for a mastermind, an elite double agent hidden in the highest corridors of power. They searched for a man in an expensive suit, someone with access to the inner circle of the Kremlin. They searched for a titan. They were looking in the wrong places. While generals paced their smoke-filled offices and screamed into secure telephones, the man they were hunting was already sitting in a freezing labor colony in the Irkutsk region, his fingers numbed by the sub-zero temperatures as he sewed rough canvas mittens for 30 kopecks a day. He was not a phantom. He was inmate number 001. He was not captured by a brilliant counter-espionage trap or betrayed by the CIA. Instead, he had vanished into the vast Soviet prison system because of a single, chaotic night on a snowy roadside in February 1982. A night where a brilliant colonel made a mistake so mundane and so violent that it provided a better cover than any Secret Service ever could. The man who had burned down the global Soviet spy network was hiding in plain sight, protected by his own disgrace. But to understand how a god of information ended up at the bottom of a frozen pit, we have to look inside the leather-scented interior of a black Volga, where a single bottle of champagne and a hidden knife were about to change history. The interior of the Black Volga was a sanctuary of Soviet privilege, a bubble of warmth protected from the biting Moscow frost of the 22nd of February 1982. Inside, it smelled of the elite, heavy French perfume, the faint ozone of the heater, and the sweet, yeasty hiss of sparkling wine that had just been uncorked. Vladimir Vetrov sat in the driver's seat, his hands, the same hands that had photographed 4,000 pages of the most sensitive technical secrets in human history, clutching a glass instead of a camera. Across from him sat Lyudmila, a woman who represented the messy, human complications of a man who lived two lives. For over a year, Vetrov had been operating at a level of stress that would have crushed an ordinary human being. He was a colonel in Directorate T, a master of scientific espionage, but he was also Farewell, the man dismantling the Soviet Union's future rolls of film at a time. This night, the champagne was not a celebration. It was a desperate attempt to drown the static in his brain. The tension between his cold, analytical duty to the French intelligence and his chaotic, resentful personal life finally reached a boiling point in the cramped, opulent silence of the car. It was not a planned betrayal or political argument that triggered the explosion, but something far more banal. A spark of domestic jealousy, a sharp word, a moment of perceived disrespect. In a heartbeat, the sophisticated analyst evaporated, replaced by a cornered animal. Vetrov reached for a knife. The first strike was frantic, tearing through the smell of perfume with the metallic scent of fresh blood. The woman's screams were muffled by the heavy glass of the Volga, the sound of the engine idling indifferently as the interior was transformed into a slaughterhouse. This was the moment the farewell dossier should have ended, but fate had one more cruel twist. A flash of a flashlight beam cut through the fogged-up windows. A random witness, a young policeman named Zhukov, was patrolling the dark roadside and noticed the rocking of the government car. He did not see a high-ranking intelligence officer. He saw a disturbance. He tapped on the glass, expecting to see a drunk official or a couple in the middle of a row. Vetrov looked up, his eyes glassy and unrecognizable. He had a choice. He could have shown his Committee for State Security identification, pulled rank, and likely walked away with nothing more than a disciplinary report. The system was designed to protect men like him. But the fuses in his mind had already blown. When the officer's face appeared in the window, Vetrov did not see a representative of the law. He saw the final obstacle to his survival. He rolled down the window, and the freezing night air rushing in to mix with the steam of hot blood. And instead of a red ID card, he lunged with the blade. The strike was surgical and savage, hitting the officer in the face, turning a messy domestic crime into an assault on the state itself. As the wounded policeman collapsed into the dirty snow and his partner rushed forward with a drawn pistol, the reality of the situation crashed down on Vetrov. In less than 5 minutes, he had traded the fate of a superpower for a cheap knife and a moment of blind rage. He was tackled into the icy slush, his face pressed against the frozen earth as the handcuffs bit into his wrists. As he lay there, the man who had outsmarted the greatest counterintelligence agencies on Earth realized that his secret war was over. He had not been defeated by a master spy or a brilliant trap. He had been destroyed by his own shaking hands. To understand the carnage on the roadside in 1982, one must look back to the quiet, sterile hallways of the KGB's Yasenyevo headquarters in 1981. Vladimir Vetrov was not a man driven by the lofty ideals of Western democracy or the cinematic desire for a better world. He was fueled by something far more volatile and toxic: distilled, professional resentment. For years, Vetrov had watched as less capable men, mediocre bureaucrats with better connections, climb the ladder of the first chief directorate while his own brilliant analytical mind was left to rot in the middle ranks. He did not want to save the world. He wanted to punish the system that had failed to recognize his greatness. As an officer in Directorate T, the elite branch responsible for scientific and technical espionage, Vetrov sat at the very center of a massive, state-sponsored theft ring. His job was to analyze the spoils of Line X, the global operation dedicated to stealing Western technology. Day after day, he sifted through blueprints of French fighter jets, American microchips, and German industrial designs. It was here that he discovered the Soviet Union's dirtiest secret. The vaunted superpower was a technological parasite. The empire was not out innovating the West. It was simply looting it, piece by piece, to keep its rusting military machine from falling apart. This realization gave Vetrov a sadistic kind of leverage. He knew exactly where the Empire's heart was located, and he knew how to stop it from beating. Armed with a tiny Minox camera and a steady hand, he began his silent crusade. He was not just a mole. He was an architect of collapse. Over the course of many months, he photographed 4,000 pages of top-secret documents, effectively creating a map of every Soviet spy, every front company, and every stolen secret across the globe. Each click of the shutter was a strike against the superiors he despised. He felt like a god hidden in a cubicle, a man who could bankrupt the Soviet military-industrial complex between lunch breaks. He passed these rolls of film to French intelligence officers in the parks of Moscow, not for bags of gold, but for the intoxicating thrill of being the most dangerous man in the room while appearing to be a nobody. He took a perverse pleasure in the irony that while the KGB generals bragged about their technological parity with the United States, he was holding the receipts that proved it was all a house of cards. Vetrov's betrayal was a grand performance for an audience of one, himself. He was proving that Vladimir Vetrov was smarter than the Central Committee, more powerful than the General Secretary, and more elusive than the entire apparatus of the Committee for State Security. He had turned the very heart of the Soviet intelligence machine against itself, driven by an ego so massive that even the collapse of an empire seemed like a fair price for his personal revenge. He believed he was invincible, the invisible master of a secret war, never suspecting that the same arrogance that made him a great spy would eventually make him a common murderer. By April of 1983, the Soviet Union was hemorrhaging its most vital secrets, and the halls of the Lubyanka were filled with the stench of fear and stale tobacco. The expulsion of 47 Soviet officials from France had sent a shockwave through the Kremlin that reached the very top. General Secretary Andropov, a man who had led the Committee for State Security for 15 years, was in a cold, calculating rage. In the smoke-filled meeting rooms of the First Chief Directorate, generals with heavy gold stars on their shoulders screamed into secure telephones and pounded their fists on oak tables. They were hunting a ghost, a titan of espionage they believed was operating from a luxury apartment in Moscow or a high-ranking office in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. They assumed Farewell was an elite CIA asset, a mastermind with a getaway plan and a cyanide pill hidden in a false tooth. They ordered massive internal purges, bugged the homes of loyal colonels, and re-examined every personnel file from the last 10 years, searching for a single slip-up in a sea of bureaucracy. The machinery of the state was grinding itself into a paranoid frenzy, looking for a giant while completely ignoring the ant beneath its boot. Thousands of kilometers to the east, in a desolate penal colony in the Irkutsk region, the man who had crippled the empire was living a nightmare of a different kind. Vladimir Vetrov was no longer a colonel. He was just another number in a gray, quilted jacket, a common criminal among thieves and disgraced minor officials. While the KGB leadership searched for him in the high heavens of geopolitical intrigue, Vetrov was hunched over a rusted sewing machine in a drafty workshop, his fingers bleeding and calloused as he struggled to meet his daily quota of canvas mittens. The man who had held the fate of the Soviet electronic industry in his hands was now being beaten by a low-level guard for not sewing fast enough or for failing to stand at attention during the morning roll call. He ate watery cabbage soup from a dented tin bowl, surrounded by the sour smell of unwashed bodies and the crushing boredom of the gulag. There was a monstrous, almost divine irony in his situation. The most hunted man on the planet was in the one place where the KGB would never think to look for a master spy, inside their own prison system, convicted of a sordid, drunken stabbing. His status as a common murderer served as a more effective disguise than any false passport or plastic surgery could ever provide. The bureaucracy he so despised was now his unintentional protector. To the prison administration, he was just a disgraced nomenklatura member who had lost his mind in a black Volga. To the investigators in Moscow, he was a phantom who had vanished into thin air. Vetrov lived in this duality, enduring the physical agony of the camp while savoring the secret knowledge that he had outplayed them all from the bottom of a frozen pit. He watched the guards with a hidden, sadistic smirk, knowing that while they treated him like dirt, he was the reason their superiors in Moscow were losing their minds and their careers. He was the most dangerous prisoner in the world, hidden in plain sight, protected by the very incompetence and arrogance of the system he had set out to destroy. By the autumn of 1983, the physical labor of the camp and the freezing Irkutsk wind had done what the elite interrogators of the KGB could not. They had broken Vladimir Vetrov's patience. The man who had orchestrated the most sophisticated intelligence heist of the 20th century was suffocating in the gray, monotonous void of prison life. It was not the hunger or the back-breaking work in the mitten factory that gnawed at his soul. It was the unbearable, deafening silence of being a nobody. A narcissist of Vetrov's caliber did not just want to destroy the Soviet system. He wanted the system to look him in the eye and acknowledge that it was he who had delivered the killing blow. He was a god in a quilted prison jacket, watching his empire burn from the sidelines, and he could no longer resist the toxic urge to take a final bow. In a moment of fatal arrogance, born of pure, distilled boredom, Vetrov decided to play one last game with fate. He picked up a scrap of paper and a pen, the only tools left to a man who still believed he was the master of his own narrative. He composed a letter, intended for the outside world, meant to reach the hands of those who would recognize his true value and perhaps facilitate a final, miraculous escape. It was a reckless, desperate gamble, a message laced with hints of his real identity and flashes of the farewell persona he had guarded so carefully for years. He believed his analytical mind was still superior, that his coded phrases would slide past the dull-witted censors of the labor camp. But he had forgotten that the massive machine he had crippled was still capable of a primal, reflex action. The letter never reached a secret handler or a grateful Western embassy. Instead, it landed on the scarred wooden desk of a low-level prison censor who noticed a strange, misplaced sophistication in the prisoner's writing. Within a week, the document was transported to Moscow, ending up in a quiet, windowless office at the Lubyanka, where a tired analyst from the Second Chief Directorate was still sifting through the smoking ruins of the farewell disaster. The room was cold and smelled of stale tea and decades of accumulated paranoia. The analyst laid Vetrov's letter next to the signatures on top-secret access logs from Directorate T. He stared at the syntax, the specific, arrogant tilt of the letters, and the casual use of classified terminology that no common street murderer should ever possess. The realization hit the room like a physical shock, a moment of freezing clarity that made the air feel thin. The silence in the office became absolute as the pieces of the shattered puzzle finally clicked together with a terrifying, undeniable logic. The phantom they had been hunting across 3 continents, the ghost who had dismantled their entire global network, was not hiding in a safe house in Paris or a suburb of Washington. He was right there, in their own database, filed under domestic homicide, and forgotten in a frozen pit 5,000 kilometers away. The analyst felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Moscow winter. It was the realization that the greatest enemy of the state had been their guest for over a year. He picked up the secure telephone, his hand trembling as he realized the hunt was over. The perfect hiding place had instantly transformed into a high-security trap, and the machinery of the state was already beginning to turn, preparing to crush the man who had dared to think he was smarter than the empire. The transition from the frozen periphery of the Irkutsk labor camp to the suffocating stone silence of Lefortovo prison in Moscow was lightning fast. Vladimir Vetrov was no longer treated like a common criminal. He was handled like a live nuclear warhead. When he was led into the interrogation room, he did not see the usual bored detectives handling domestic stabbings. Instead, he saw the hollowed-out eyes of the high-ranking counterintelligence colonels he had once served alongside. On the scarred metal table lay the physical manifestation of his secret life. Volume after volume of the farewell dossier, 4,000 pages of his own betrayal. This was the moment of payoff. Most men would have collapsed in terror, but Vetrov did something that chilled the interrogators to the bone. He smiled. He looked at the evidence not with fear, but with the pride of an artist at his own gallery opening. For the first time since that bloody night in the Black Volga, he was not just a murderer. He was the main character of a global catastrophe. He finally had the audience he had craved during those long months in the mitten factory. Vetrov requested a pen and a stack of paper, and over the following days, he composed a confession that read more like a hero's memoir than a plea for mercy. He described every roll of film, every meeting in Moscow parks, and every technological secret he had handed to the West with a sadistic level of detail. He mocked the blindness of the system, savoring the shock and humiliation on the faces of the officers across the table. He was writing his own legend, ensuring that even if they killed him, they would never be able to forget how easily he had outplayed them. But the Soviet system had one final, crushing lesson for his ego. On the 23rd of January, 1985, the theatricality Vetrov expected was denied to him. There was no public trial, no final speech from a podium, and no defiant slogans. He was led into a windowless basement chamber that smelled of damp concrete and stale tobacco. A bored prosecutor read the rejection of his appeal for clemency in a flat, administrative drone, treating the end of a human life like a routine inventory check. Vetrov opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to deliver one last insult, but the machinery of the state was finished with his voice. He was forced to his knees. A single, sharp crack of a pistol echoed through the underground corridor, and the man who had fancied himself the destroyer of empires slumped onto the stained floor. The true horror of his end was not the bullet. It was the absolute indifference that followed. No one mourned, and the system did not collapse. The empire simply stepped over his warm corpse and continued its slow, grinding march. Within 5 minutes, a janitor with a bucket of chlorinated water and a rough rag had washed away the dark puddle on the floor, erasing the only physical trace of Vladimir Vetrov. The documents were filed away in a dusty, nameless archive, and the world moved on. He had wanted to be a martyr who changed history, but in the end, he was just a defective part that had been successfully replaced and forgotten.